Hello. The title of this lecture is a general description of parole in Hawaii. I'm going to basically explain to you how the system of parole is operated in Hawaii very generally. Again, I would like to remind you that I need to take sips of water occasionally as I narrate this slide, and I apologize. In a normal lecture I get a pause, but when you narrate a PowerPoint you just have to keep going, so it makes your mouth very dry. The sources for this lecture, I primarily draw upon reports written for the state of Hawaii by my PhD committee chair, Professor Emeritus Gene Kassabaum. I'm making a big deal out of his title because besides being a great professor, he's an even more outstanding person. He's truly the type of professor who treats students like real people and is a wonderful person. But these two citations that you see in front of you that are available at that website are the most recent and up-to-date items on parole specifically to Hawaii. Next. Okay. I apologize again if this seems dated, but the goal of this lecture is to provide a general description of the parole system specifically in Hawaii. These sources seen here may seem a bit dated, 1999 and 2001, but these are the most up-to-date academic publications regarding parole specific to Hawaii. So by the time you watch this lecture, they may have been programmatic policy or staffing changes that only a person working in the system would know about. But again, this is the most up-to-date information that is available to the public, meaning you and I. I want you to recall the differences between parole and probation. If a person is sentenced to probation, they are not incarcerated or locked up, but they live in the community under a set of restrictions or conditions of their probation sentence. Basically, they have to be a good citizen, not commit any crimes, meet their parole officer, do what he or she says, look for employment, etc. Parole is essentially early release from prison. So a person is incarcerated, but they're let out early from prison. So you serve a portion of your prison sentence. You are let out into the community, again under a very similar set of conditions. And if the person follows them, they never have to go back to prison again, and they can serve out the remainder of their sentence out in the community. Of course, if they mess up or violate those conditions while on parole, they can be sent back to prison to serve more time. So here we're going to be talking about parole. So you've been incarcerated for a period of time and then you're let out early, essentially, to serve the remainder of your sentence. Now, it may seem that, oh, you should never have parole, but locking up a person is tremendously expensive, and we essentially send half of our prisoners out of state because prison space to build and maintain is so expensive. I believe in Hawaii it costs about $30,000 a year to have a person locked up. I was just down at the Judiciary Committee. But anyway, parole is a much cheaper alternative, and if you can keep the community safe while doing it, it's a net benefit to the taxpayer and also the prisoner, because the vast majority of people are in prison are going to eventually get out. So it makes sense to let them get out a little bit early but still have our hooks in them, and if you screw up, we're going to bring you back, as opposed to just letting you out and now we got to catch you committing a new crime. Okay. Now, I'm going to explain a little bit about how parole works in Hawaii. Something called the Hawaii Paroling Authority, or HPA, is the main organization that administers and controls parole in Hawaii. So the laws of the state of Hawaii provide for sentencing of a convicted felony offenders to either probation or prison. Okay? If the offender is sent to prison, a non-judiciary body called the Hawaii Paroling Authority, or the HPA, I will use that HPA from now on, actually determines the minimum sentence. Okay, that minimum sentence is the date that the prisoner becomes eligible for parole. Remember, if you're convicted of a felony, the judge can either put you in probation, which they don't send you to prison, or they send you to prison. If you are sent to prison, the HPA actually determines which date you're eligible for parole, which means you can go out into the community under a set of conditions. Okay, so the HPA determines the minimum sentence and exercises supervision over the released prisoner. Okay, an offender may be on parole in the community for a stipulated period of time and then discharged, or that means they complete their sentence, or the offender may be found in violation of these conditions of his or her parole release and then is subject to being returned to prison. So essentially the HPA performs all these functions for the parole system in Hawaii and is what I say is the main player or the main organization. They essentially run parole in Hawaii, and interestingly, as you'll see on the next slide, they set the minimum sentence. Sentencing to prison and parole, and we have to go to prison first to be eligible for parole, is somewhat unique in Hawaii. Hawaii is sort of unique in that this responsibility of sentencing is divided amongst all three branches of government: the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive. Remember, judiciary, that's the judges, the courts. Legislative are the people who are elected to make the laws, and the executive is the governor. Okay. So Hawaii is unique in that all three branches of government are involved in sentencing. Most unique in Hawaii is decisions to grant parole and most certainly revoke parole rest under the executive rather than the judicial branch. Okay, remember the HPA is set under the under the executive branch. Okay, and I'll explain that in a second. In most states, the judiciary, or the courts, or the judge, if you will, handle this function of whether or not a person should be eligible for parole and whether they should revoke parole, etc. So Hawaii is kind of unique in that sense, and the Hawaiian Paroling Authority is unique, sort of controls all this stuff, and it's unique in that it's under the executive. Okay, let me explain how this works in greater detail. The judiciary, the judge basically decides if prison confinement or some alternative sentence is appropriated for the convicted felon. So that's how the judiciary, the judge, is involved, or the courts, if you will. The legislative branch is involved in that if the sentence is a term in prison, the Hawaii Revised Statutes provide that the defendant must be sentenced to a maximum term of confinement for each felony. In Hawaii, it's life sentence for murder, 20 years for felony A, which is the most serious, 10 years for a felony B, and 5 years for a felony C. So the judge, in essence, the legislative branch tells the judge that if you put somebody in prison, you must sentence them to the maximum for whatever felony level they were convicted of. Okay. Now, interestingly, oh, by the way, some repeat offenders have actually enhanced sentences that make it even more than what you see in front of you on the screen. Now, what's interesting here is even though the judge sets them for the maximum as defined by law, the executive branch, which controls the Hawaii Paroling Authority, actually reviews the case after the person has been sent to prison, and one, sets the minimum sentence. That's the earliest date the prisoner is eligible for release on parole. Two, they either approve or deny release at that time. And three, if the person is released on parole, the HPA specifies the conditions of parole. And four, the HPA also determines whether or not these conditions are violated and has the decision to return the person on parole to confinement, and also decides if parole should be revoked or if the person may continue on parole. So although all three branches of state government have a part in parole, in practice, HPA operates the system of parole and actually does sets the actual minimum sentence, not the judge. That's very interesting from a public administration standpoint. That means the judge doesn't have any discretion, essentially, other than whether or not I should send you to prison or not. And then the Hawaii Paroling Authority actually does what the judges would do in many states, which is determine the amount of time you have to serve until you're eligible for parole. Excuse me, next slide. The HPA actually consists of one full-time chairperson and 2 part-time members. Interestingly, the Hawaii Paroling Authority, these people are appointed by the governor and confirmed by the state senate. So essentially this is a political office where you are appointed. You don't have to have any special qualifications. All you have to do is be appointed by the governor and confirmed by the state senate. The HPA is attached to the Department of Public Safety. That's the organization that runs the prisons. But as of 1999, the latest information that's available, interestingly, for administrative purposes, decisions of the HPA are not subject to the approval of the Department of Public Safety. So although the Department of Public Safety, which is also under the executive branch, runs the prisons, essentially, the HPA, in essence, is autonomous, and they do not have to have their decisions approved by the Department of Public Safety. Next slide. Okay. Again, as noted above, the HPA actually sets the minimum sentence for a person who is sent to prison. That is to say, the earliest date when they'll be eligible for parole. That's, again, early release from prison. The HPA also decides whether or not to grant parole in the first place, the conditions of parole, and whether or not to revoke parole. Now, the technical details, if you're interested in all of this and how, when and how the decisions are made, you can look in the appendix of Survival on Parole, a study of post-prison adjustment in the state of Hawaii. Basically, that's the 1990 citation on the very first slide. So if you look at the 1990 report, you can see in the appendix, you'll see all the gory details if you're interested. I just kind of want to give you a basic overview. Again, interestingly about Hawaii, many, if not most, of states sort of put these functions under the judicial branch, but Hawaii puts them under the executive branch. And again, the HPA is essentially a political appointment. As in any political appointment, the governor has the option of appointing people to certain posts. And so the governor is going to put people whom he or she likes. Or it's hard to imagine that a governor would appoint people to the HPA unless they either like them or they agree with what they've done in the past, etc. In many states, judges are elected. So in essence, the HPA is indirectly out of control of the voter. All we do is elect the governor. The governor then appoints the HPA. Okay, I'm going to talk about a few of the factors that the HPA considers when they set the minimum state. Okay, when they set the minimum sentence. Again, what this is what happens is you get sentenced to prison by the judge. Once you're in prison, the HPA meets and they look at your case, and they're going to set the minimum sentence. And the minimum sentence is, okay, although you were, for example, sentenced to 10 years, we're going to tell you at what point you're actually eligible to apply for parole, which is early release from prison. As in other states, a variety of factors are considered when the HPA sets this minimum sentence. The difference is then, again, in that many states this minimum is set by the judge when statutes allow him or her discretion, or it's mandated by legislative statute. Okay. Factors to be considered in fixing a minimum sentence include the nature and circumstance of the offense, the history of the inmate, the need for the sentence imposed to reflect the seriousness of the offense. For example, if you do something really bad, they want to make sure that that minimum sentence reflects the bad thing that you did, if you will. They want to promote respect for the law and provide just punishment. The sentence also must afford deterrence to criminal conduct and protect the public from further crimes by this inmate, and provide educational vocational training. And there's also some sort of mitigating factors, all of which are spelled out in HRS. So basically, this is a generic explanation of the factors that the HPA board considers when they set a minimum sentence for an inmate. And they're very similar to other states. But you should essentially know what they are. They're pretty commonsensical if you read them. Next slide. Okay. Now when they decide to grant or deny parole or to violate parole, here's how that decision process makes. Okay, the first decision they make is should we grant or deny parole? That means we've set your minimum date, and when that date comes, are we going to let you go out on parole or not? So if they grant parole, you get to go out on parole. If they deny parole, you stay in prison. Okay. So that decision to grant or deny parole is based on a number of criteria that are, again, quite generic, and they can be found in many textbooks. But here's what we do in Hawaii. The inmate has to have a viable parole plan. They must have been a good boy or a good girl while locked up. Essentially, they're not going to let somebody out on parole who hasn't followed the rules in prison. Okay, if you've been a total terror in prison the whole time, they're going to say, hey, we're not letting you out, because if you can't act right here, you're certainly not going to act right out on the streets. They have to agree to the terms and conditions of parole, which is set by the HPA board. Basically, the HPA, those are sort of the rules of parole. Basically, if we're going to let you on parole, here are the terms and conditions, and you have to agree to them. Now, the decision to violate parole, this means you've now been granted parole, you've been out there, and for some reason you haven't followed the rules. And now the HPA is going to decide whether or not they should revoke your parole. Now we're going to take you out of the community and take you back into prison. Okay. So the decision to violate parole is made when the HPA board decides that the preponderance of the evidence suggests that the parolee has violated those violated those terms and conditions. Okay, the preponderance of the evidence is just a fancy way of saying they look at everything and they make a global judgment. Okay. Now, when they decide that a parolee has violated the terms and conditions of parole, they have a number of options. They can revoke parole. That means send them back into prison. They can defer revocation, which is kind of like a fancy way of saying, okay, you're revoked, but we're going to give you one more chance. And if you mess up this time, we're really going to send you back to prison, if you will. Or they can continue them on parole. But let's imagine that a person gets let out on parole and that they followed the rules. When they have, that means that they've successfully completed their term of parole, and then they are free from their prison term completely. They're a free man or woman, if you will. Okay, so that's a little bit of a description of how parole is when you're eligible for parole, and then the process of should you make an application to the HPA. They're going to decide whether we're going to let you out on parole, they will grant parole, or whether we're going to deny parole. And then once you're out on parole, they sort of follow you and decide whether or not they're going to let you stay out on parole or put you back in prison. Again, this is sort of where the HPA would be dependent upon reports from the parole officers. Essentially, to be successful out on parole, you basically are going to have to do what your parole officer says, more or less, and follow the rules. Okay, there are special units in HPA, and it's kind of a no-duh situation, but these special units do exactly what their titles might suggest. There are 3 special parole units in HPA, and they deal with people who have special needs. Okay, but first of all, what I want you to know is sort of generic parole. You would not be in a special unit. If you're under generic parole, not under one of these special units, you're under what's called community supervision. Okay, that's generic one. And then these special units do exactly what the name suggests, intensive supervision. They say, well, you need more supervision than the average bear on community supervision. Mental health unit, you have mental health issues. Sex offender treatment program, you're obviously a sex offender of some form. So these 3 special units deal with those people with those special needs, and I'm going to explain what they do in the next few slides. Okay, intensive supervision. Okay, exactly what the intensive supervision unit, or ISP, deals with parolees who obviously need more supervision than the average parolee, and they have more special conditions attached to their parole. They have more contacts with their parole officer, especially in the first 6 months. They have earlier curfew hours and more curfew checks. According to the 1990 report, a decision is made at the 6-month point whether that person should be moved to normal parole, i.e. What we call community supervision in Hawaii, or whether they need to remain in intensive supervision. So you're going to be in intensive supervision for at least 6 months, and then at that point they're going to decide whether you still need that intensive supervision or not. Okay. As you might expect, to get into ISP in the first place, these parolees are deemed by the HPA to pose a greater threat to the community than a typical parolee. So greater effort is made to find them if they abscond, or that's a fancy word for saying that they take off while they're on parole. They basically stop meeting with their parole officer. Means you've absconded with parole and we don't know where the heck you are. Okay, next slide. Mental health unit. Okay. This unit, the special unit of the HPA, again, obviously deals with parolees who have more mental health issues than the typical parolee. The parole officers work closely with the psychiatric social worker, and the parolees under mental health supervision are also subject to more rigid office visits and field visits than would be an average community supervision parolee. Again, they have earlier curfews than they would for normal people. Another special condition for mental health parolees is to comply with mental health treatment, which includes taking all prescribed medications, going to therapy treatments, etc. But actually, taking medications is typically the biggest issue in remaining in compliance with parole for this group of parolees. Generally, these parolees are truly mentally ill, and they only become a danger to themselves or others if they stop taking their medications. If you've ever walked down the street and see those people that are talking to themselves and muttering around, these people are truly profoundly mentally ill, and are most likely not taking medications. What kind of happens to people who are truly mentally ill, it's not an absence of will. We just think, hey, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, just try harder. Well, unfortunately, these people, no matter what they do, they have voices that talk to them, etc. And what happens is they take their medications, the voices stop, and they say, hey, I'm not crazy after all. I don't need these stupid meds. And these meds have side effects that are unpleasant, and so what they do is they stop taking them, and then the voices come back, etc. So generally, according to the report, the mental health unit, these people generally only become a danger to themselves or society when they stop taking their meds. Okay, the Sex Offender Treatment Program, or I don't know how you would say that acronym there, SOT. Okay, this is interesting in that it occurs both in prison, there's sex offender treatment in prison, and also while the person is out on parole. Okay, it's worth describing the in-prison program here. because one must complete that program in prison to be eligible for parole. Completion of the prison-based treatment program is based upon a clinical discharge rather than mere graduation. And you must have a clinical discharge as a precondition to be eligible for release on parole. That should make intuitive sense to you. What we're saying is that these sex offenders have got a special, if you will, mental health problem, and we're not going to just let you go through, what do they call that? You just sort of fake it and pretend like you're really trying. Basically what they have is they have a group of mental health experts, specifically sex offender health experts, and they are going to decide as a group whether this person appears clinically ready, similar to letting you out of the state mental hospital. A group of people who are mental health experts get together and they say, okay, we've made a clinical assessment of this person. In our best judgment, they're ready to go out. A person is designated as there's many ways in Hawaii that a person can be designated as a sex offender. First way is if they were sent to prison because of a conviction for a sex offense, such as molestation or rape, etc., or if the offense was sexually motivated, or if they had a prior sex offense, a conviction as adult, or as a juvenile. It's called as an adult, just by the way, it's called a conviction, but we don't actually convict juveniles. We call it adjudication, but it's essentially the same thing. Or they have a prior sex offense charge as an adult or a juvenile. So one doesn't necessarily have to have been convicted of a prior sex offense. You could have just had a prior sex offense charge and got off, if you will. But the chair of the HPA is authorized to designate a person as a sex offender based upon these criteria. That's a tremendous amount of discretion if you think about it. The Hawaii Paroling Authority may require a sex offender to participate in this prison-based sex offender treatment as a precondition of parole. That was challenged, but the Hawaii Supreme Court has upheld it. So you can see the two cases there, and I wouldn't ever test you. Give me the names of the cases that challenged, that upheld the Hawaii Paroling Authority's ability to require sex offender treatment in prison as a precondition of parole. Now, I may ask you, though, true or false. The HPA may require a person to have sex offender treatment in prison before they'll let them out on parole. But I won't test you on factoids like, give me Neal versus Shimoda et al. 1997. I don't do that to you. Okay. As of 1997, the in-prison sex offender treatment program involved from a 25 to a 70-week schedule, emphasizing relapse prevention, again, not graduation. So completion of this program in prison is based upon clinical discharge rather than graduation. 25 weeks, that's about half a year. 70 weeks, that's almost a year and a half, not quite. So it's become quite extensive if you think about it, as that evolution from 25 to 70 weeks is pretty darn extensive. But again, when you're in prison, you can't just go through the motions. Well, you could, but you'd have to fake out all the clinical people, and they would say, okay, we're going to clinically discharge this person, as opposed to just graduate them. Okay. And again, as you might hope, this program in prison emphasizes relapse prevention. Relapse means you go back and commit another sex offense, if you will. So if your thing is molesting little children, they would work on you ways that you could prevent yourself from doing that again. If your thing was raping women, the vast majority of rapists are men who rape women, but not exclusively. But let's say your thing was raping, they would work on that. If your thing was playing with yourself in public, that would be a sex offense. They would work on you on not doing that. So relapse prevention, not graduation here, is the goal. And you must be clinically discharged. Okay, now when you are on parole or out of prison, you have now graduated from the in-prison program based upon clinical discharge, and you're out in the community, if you will. And so I'm going to describe a little bit of now what happens with sex offender while they're out on parole. Okay, similar to the intensive supervision unit and the mental health parolees, the parolees in this sex offender program are viewed as in need of intensive supervision. They're required to report to the parole office once per week for the first 6 months on parole. They're also subjected to alternative forms of contact, such as increased field visits, curfew checks, etc. Furthermore, while they are out of prison and in the community, they have to attend treatment at a private non-for-profit sex offender treatment centers. So essentially, while you're out in the community, you got to do all the things that normal people got to do who are on parole, but you also have to go to a treatment program that's specific for sex offending. All people who are sex offenders are subject to this sort of, you're out in the community, but you have sex offender treatment. So this treatment is mandatory for all sex offenders. It's a special condition while being out on parole. And again, just like in prison, the parolees must remain in this program while on parole until they are clinically discharged. They're not just graduated. So basically, again, there's going to be a group of people who work at this treatment center, and they are going to decide as a group that this person has done the work and is ready to go out there. That's sort of what clinically discharged is. It's a clinical decision made by physicians and whatnot. Should the parolee not be clinically discharged at the end of the funded sessions by the state, he or she must complete treatment at his own expense until he or she is clinically discharged. Again, due to the concern for public safety, these sort of parolees are immediately sent back to prison if they're terminated from sex offender treatment. Only a clinical discharge is acceptable. And again, like the mental health unit, parole officers in this unit meet once a week with the primary sex offender treatment therapists, and they talk about the parole in these meetings. Sex offenders are also required to participate in group therapy. It's kind of unclear whether or not they have individual therapy sessions too from the report. I would imagine so, but I don't know. But for the purpose of this lecture, that's not really important. What's important is that they get treatment in prison, and then once out on parole, they also get treatment. And a group of people who are professionals in the field decide, doesn't matter if you've done the 70 weeks, for example, if they don't think you're ready, you don't get out. And while you're out on parole, you can see there's about 60 to 70 sessions twice a week. Doesn't matter whether you've done those. The actual time is going to vary because the decision to release a person from sex offender treatment is based on clinical discharge. Okay? Again, I'm not going to test you on the 60 to 70 sessions twice a week factoid, but I would test you on the notion that, actual time is going to vary because it's based upon clinical discharge. I've said that over and over in this part of the lecture, so I expect you to know that. Interestingly, there's only some anecdotal evidence if you look at the last bullet point. According to the director of the program, at the time of a report from he or she looked at the data in 1998 to 1993. There were 192 people in the program for that time period, and the rate of relapse was quite low, contrary to what you might think. Apparently only 3 out of the 192 people committed a new felony sex offense. So that's kind of our fear, if you think about it. We've let a sex offender out into the community, and our fear is that they're going to go do it again. So apparently, only about 2% of the people in this program in Hawaii actually went out and did a new felony sex offense. They could have done a non-felony sex offense, of course. Interestingly, of the people who had only about 28% of them had parole revoked, mostly for technical reasons. There was only 12 of the 54 actually had committed other felonies not related to sex, and the remainder of them were for technical violations. So 54 of the 192 had their parole revoked. Only 12 of those, I don't know what 12 is of 52, but we're committing new offense. The vast majority are doing technical violations. That means they're not following their treatment, they're not meeting with their parole officer, they're not meeting their curfews, etc. So it doesn't exactly mean that they're being perfect people. But so you should keep that in mind. I mean, they are not following the rules. So a technical violation means you're not following the rules. You may be not out committing new crimes as far as we know, but you ain't following the rules. So that's not good. So of those 54, only about 21 had to go back to prison-based sex offender treatment. So 54 people out of 192 were returned to prison, and of those, only less than half, they decided, well, you need to go back to prison-based sex offender treatment program. Kind of makes sense because all of these people were clinically discharged in the first place, and if most of them are being placed back into prison for technical violations and not going out and reoffending sexually, they say, hey, what's the point of keeping you in prison for another year if you're not out there? Essentially what your problem is following the rules out there. So it kind of makes sense if you think about it like that. Okay, I'm not going to test you on these exact percentages. I would want you to know that the rate of relapse is apparently quite low, and that most of them are for technical violations. Okay, so I'm not interested in you memorizing factoids, but I do want you to get the story of how the system works, if you will. Okay, in conclusion, although all three branches of Hawaii government play a role in parole, I just did a rhyme. Parole is essentially run by the HPA, the Hawaii Paroling Authority, which under the executive branch. They are appointed by the governor, and they make almost all the major parole decisions in Hawaii, including setting the minimum sentence. That's the earliest date they're eligible for parole. Whether or not to grant parole in the first place, that's let you out early. They also set the conditions of parole and make the decision whether to revoke parole or not. And then there's also special units in HPA that we went over and what they do. Alrighty, that's the end of this lecture.